Very, very well. It is Q here, and I just had Sublime open, which was the message that I used to copy and paste into the into various Slack channels that I'm announcing the stream for. Anywho, it is Wednesday, January 27th, 11:31 a.m. Very, very cold in Toronto. It's snowing. Hope you're doing very, very well on your side. So, stream today. I'm going to be going over I'm going to be walking through the process of migrating or integrating a component from this G2 components repo, which is the new component system for Gutenberg, into Gutenberg. So we have a working kind of issue right now, I think. Yeah. So there is a medium-sized kind of component list that basically talks about all the little components we need to bring over to kind of backfill to create the font size picker component that we recently migrated or integrated into Gutenberg. And it's built with lots and lots of many little things. And for today, I'm going to be bringing over this grid component. Grid component is one of the lower level components of the G2 component library. It is Grid and Flex are basically the two layout components that kind of construct anything related to layouts. Grid is like used mediumly in a way. It's not as frequent as, whoops, I hit my mic. It's not used as frequently as something like Flex, but it's low level enough and it's kind of simple enough for me to kind of talk about and demonstrate for this little walkthrough. Cool. So on my little terminal right now, I have my local Gutenberg repo fired up. I'm going to make sure I pull in the latest. Cool. I'm just going to create a brand new branch. These little G and B, that's just my local terminal aliases. How do you even create a branch without that? G branch something? I forgot. I have it alias, so I don't need to remember because I totally don't know how to do that anymore. So GNB grid component. All right. I'm going to fire this up in my local VS Code. That's the wrong project. Here we go. Nope, that's also the wrong project. Here we go. Cool. So we're going to be bringing this component over into the WordPress components directory, if I can find it. It is this giant one here. Cool. So from this list, there may be some components that are already in the repository. Some there may not be. So for example, Flex, it's basically the same component. Flex was something I added into WordPress components, but then it's been adjusted and improved in the new G2 components component system library. So if you were to bring in Flex, you'd have to do it in a way where you have to make a decision. If the component is basically identical in terms of its API, then you can probably just replace this one and it should be fine. If it's quite different, then you may have to do some sort of adapter. You may have to use some sort of adapter that allows the component to be stable for both the current implementation, that is the WordPress components implementation, and also supporting the brand new component system implementation. So for that example, we have the font size picker, which was recently merged in sometime last week, I think. Thank you to all the folks that have been involved. You've all been very wonderful, very helpful, and very supportive in getting this thing in there. So we won't be using this kind of method for Grid just because Grid does not exist within WordPress components, which makes it a little bit easier, but I will talk about it. So if you jump into font size picker, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see all the code you have here inside font size picker index. This is the code that this is the current WordPress component implementation of it. We did not change anything. with the exception of how it's being exported. You can see where we've wrapped it with this with next component higher order thing, this little HOC higher order component, which comes from this new directory we've added inside. So we have this next directory to kind of indicate, oh, this is the next or the new version of the component that we want to build and move and support moving forward. So this is where the new G2 kind of component will be moved to. So we can see we have the font size control, we have all the utilities, the styles, and all the little bits that make up this component. But let's take a look at this main kind of index file, this main next file. And this is kind of where we have the adapter. You can see we have this with next component right here, and it's using the it's using this with next also thing from this particular directory. All the kind of adapters within WordPress components that's going to be following this convention will be using this with next higher order component. So we have that. We're basically passing in the old or the current component for font size picker. We're going to give it the alternate component that the new version of the component, and we're going to give it a namespace. So what this effectively does is when a font size picker renders within Gutenberg, we have these little flags, feature flags in a way, set up so that the UI or can control when it would be appropriate to render the new one or the old one. This little layer, it makes it much safer to roll out these new components. Otherwise, we have no control. It either renders a new one or the old one, and it may break and bad things happen. But this flag allows us to control it, so it's like, oh, okay, only render the new font size control in this one little area, make sure it's fine. For font size picker, it's not that big of a deal since we don't use it too frequently within Gutenberg. I think we only use it in like one or two places. But there may be a chance that a third-party developer or whatever may have used this component somewhere else, either in Gutenberg in their custom blocks, or perhaps somewhere randomly in WP admin, like in the customizer or somewhere else. Yeah, again, font size pickers is a little bit more niche in terms of what it does, but having this strategy and understanding these parts is important for something more generic, like a button or an input, something that would, in theory, render in lots of different places. We need this little extra layer of control. So that's what this is, this with next component. It basically takes in the current implementation, the next implementation that we want to set up, namespace, and this basically registers it within the Gutenberg UI system so that the Gutenberg can, with more control, it can render the either the newer component or the older component, depending on how it is we're rolling things out. There is another little bit of a detail inside of here. So we can see that we have props here. Props, this is basically, you know, if you were to use this font size picker, it's whatever properties you give it. If there is a chance that the properties for the new G2 components right here is different than the one that is currently existing, for example, this is the current old, I'm just going to use the term old. We have the old one, and then we have the new one. So the old one, if the props, that being the component API, if it's different compared to the new one, this layer also gives us the opportunity to remap those props so that it'll kind of smoothen the period where there is a little bit of duplication or a little bit of fragmentation. Ultimately, the end user, the folks that are using this component either within Gutenberg Core or if you're a third-party block developer, if you are using this, you should not have to change your code, because whether the old properties are renamed or adjusted, it'll all be handled in this kind of prop remapping kind of phase that this little adapter affords us to do. In this case, we don't need to do anything. But let's say, for example, there may be a chance where I don't know what's a good one. Oh, yeah. This is pretend, okay? This is pretend. Next, props. Props. Okay. So let's pretend that the old implementation of font size picker looks like this. Right? You have all your items, you give it items, and then it does the actual current, this is the actual component API, but bear with me. So pretend that's the old one, and for reasons, we believe that the better API should kind of look like this, right? So if the new one renders, and if we didn't have this little prop kind of adaptation remapping layer, that means that wherever it is font size picker is rendered inside of Gutenberg or anywhere else, they would have to change this implementation. They would have to change options to items. But that's bad. We shouldn't expect other people to adjust things as we start updating these components. So what we can do is we can pluck out, we can do something like this, where we pluck out items and we just remap that to options, because options is the correct API that we would like. So now we have this new object, this next props thing, where we basically kept everything with the exception of items. We're just remapping items to options, and we'll pass in our remapped properties down to our new component. The new component understands what all this stuff means because we made it happy, and everything is fine. So that's what this little layer allows us to do. We don't need to do this for font size picker because I believe the component APIs map 1-to-1. We don't need to do this for the grid component that we're going to be moving over today because the grid component does not exist within Gutenberg, so it's easy. We just basically need to create a new component. However, for things like button, potentially some inputs, well, definitely button, we'll have to do this because the old implementation button, for example, if you want to adjust the size of the button, you would have to do this, right? You would give it an is small, which is effectively a Boolean. The new implementation has this. Size is a property, and then you tell it what size you want: small, medium, large, and so on. So we have to do some sort of remapping from this to this. The old component will render like this. The new component will render like this. But effectively, where it's being used, you could do either that or that. Yeah, so we'll have to make sure your adapter thing, you're able to one. So, anywho, hopefully this was helpful. I feel like this example would be a little bit easier to follow if I were to migrate a more complex component, which I may do a follow-up stream or video on. But for today, we're going to be moving over grid. So let's take a look at the grid component within the G2 components repo. So going over to this thing on GitHub, what thing? This is URL, this URL. Going over to this URL on GitHub, github.com/itsjohnq/G2. And then we go into the packages directory, and then we go into components, src. You can also clone this down onto your computer, by the way, but I'm just going to go over this on GitHub because it's easier. So we take a look at grid. There's a bunch of little files in here. We have the main component, we have the README file, some tests, some stories for Storybook, and so on. We're basically going to be copying and pasting all the code from here into Gutenberg. Cool. So let's just do that. Here, we're going to... Oh, one thing to point out. The naming conventions of these files are different. So when I built this library, I named it in a way that was just quicker for me. I'm more used to naming things where like components are kind of capitalized, right? And you have dot notation for subfiles, whereas Gutenberg, everything is kebab cased, lowercase plus hyphens to distinguish between, keywords. So that's something that we'll have to adjust, which is fine. It's not that hard. So inside of Gutenberg here, components, we will create a brand new component called grid. Okay. And we have some tests. We have some stories. Let me just see how it is they do this. All right. So stories is a directory, and test is a directory. Test, not singular, I guess. So I'll just copy that as well. Stories, test. Nope, that's a file. I need to make I need to make a folder, not a file. Let's see. Stories, folder, test. Alrighty. And the first file I'm going to move over is grid.index raw. Again, you can, if you had this cloned locally on your computer, you can just literally copy and paste a file in there or drag and drop, whichever you're more comfortable with. I'm just going to do it with GitHub today. It's all the same. Basically copy and pasting things into here. It's going to complain because we don't have these files there. So VS Code is very smart. It's going to, oh, you don't have grid. What are you talking about? So I am going to go to here. Cool. I'm going to create a brand new file called grid.js. Paste it into here. This is also another kind of detail that is interesting. So the main file, the main component within WordPress components, a convention at least, all the code lives in the index.js. How I've written G2 components, and if you were to check out most component libraries, they've done it in a way where index is the main exporter. And you have the actual component in like a dedicated file or something like that. That is, that's preference, I suppose. That's debatable whether one is better or whichever the case. I don't know. So for truncate, for example, we stuck with that convention here. If it's better, but I may be wrong. So if this were to change, just a heads up, that's what happened. But for now, I'm going to keep that kind of relationship. So I've added a grid file. Things are still complaining, but we'll take care of that. And I also need this use grid hook thing. Alrighty. Use grid.js. And there's a bunch of things that are complaining, but that's fine. Okay, so now I'm just going to rename this to grid, and this as use grid. So the main index is satisfied. The files are there. We're able to export things from that. You can see, oh, VS Code is green. Cool. So if I take a look at grid, there's some things that are complaining. So within G2 components, certain ones are built using this hook-based kind of setup. So what I mean by that is, and this one's a little bit more tricky, but that's okay. So the convention we've kind of settled on in terms of separating kind of presentation and logic, that is for, what's a good example? Text, I think, is a good example. Yeah. All right. No, it's not. It's just using the same kind of create component kind of setup, which isn't bad. It's just slightly more difficult to follow. So I want something that's a little bit more straightforward, so it's easier to follow. Cool. Card. All right, card. So for card, we have this use card thing. And effectively what this hook does is that it prepares all the properties for our component. This one doesn't do too much. It just like grabs some properties, adds some styles, and like uses another bit of another hook from somewhere else and kind of combines it all together. But you can think of this hook, this component hook, right? So if it's a card, there's a use card. If it's a surface component, there's a use surface. And for grid today, for grid, there's a use grid. This is effectively the brains of that component. It does a prop remapping. It does the style kind of merge thing. It just prepares all the properties for our component. And what's nice about this is because all the kind of like, all that kind of stuff lives here. So effectively, all we need to do in our card component is we just need to use it. Right? We give it the properties so that it knows what to do. and we pluck out whatever it is we need, and then we just apply it into our views, into our view within the context of this new component system. It's basically a very, very smart div. We just basically give the view whatever it needs, whether it's like class names or children or whatever the case. You can think of this purely mostly as a presentational layer. There's no real kind of like handle on click or any of those kind of event handler anythings. All of that is concentrated in the component hook, the use card. So if card needed to do things like on click something, on drag, any of that kind of stuff, it would live here. Inside of the actual component, all of those properties have already been pre-prepared. It's just plucked out and just applied onto views, onto divs or buttons or whatever the case may be. We found that this separation was very nice, especially during large refactors where we needed to kind of adjust how the business logic worked for component handling, whether it was for performance reasons or state management strategy reasons or whatever the case may be. Having this setup was very, very helpful. And it also keeps the view part of it, the presentational part, very, very light. It's easier to kind of see and kind of reason about in a way. So that's the kind of thing we have. If you were to jump into a G2 component and you were to see this kind of use grid, when we're talking about the grid component, if you're going to see this kind of component hook thing, that's effectively what it is. It is the brains of the component. The main component is just there for, presentational reasons. It's just rigging. It's just there to kind of bring everything together. I had to give a shout out. This particular strategy was something that I stole/borrowed from RioKit. Got to give a shout out to my boy Diego whenever I can. This is a phenomenal, amazing library used in many, many component systems around the world now. I'm so proud of this thing. But if you were to take a look at the internals of RioKit, that's kind of how they rig things up. Anywho, shout outs to Diego and friends. So, grid. Use grid. Cool. So now we're going to create this use grid hook, right? We're going to pluck out everything that we need from properties. But the interesting thing, though, is we're not doing this directly. We're not destructuring from the incoming props. We're actually passing everything into another hook called use context system. The context system is something that is part of this new component system kind of setup. It provides the opportunity for components to basically be able to talk to each other, for the system to understand, the rendering of the components and to be able to modify them if needed based on certain circumstances. So, for example, let's say this grid is a bad example because it's so generic. But let's say, for example, we're working on the brand new, the font size picker, right? And we want to modify it if it somehow renders in a modal, right? Let's pretend the font size picker renders in a modal, and we want to make a little tweak to it. We can kind of do it more in like a larger scoped, more global context kind of way by targeting it using the context system to make that adjustment, versus having to go down to that specific, font size picker thing and making the adjustment there. It's a very, very powerful technique within the G2 components library. It's used all the time for components to kind of talk to each other. So, for example, I think this is done in the menu component. If there's some layout stuff that's adjusted for menu items. Oh yeah, a menu item is slightly adjusted if it renders within a dropdown. And it's kind of done through this system. Anywho, that's what this context system is. We're basically passing the props into it. It's just like a pass-through thing. And we're telling it, hey, we need properties specifically for grid. Grid is the namespace that we're registering this component under. So what this does is that it'll give us the properties that are incoming, but it'll also give us the properties that that may have been registered under grid somewhere in the context, right? If this component, if somehow like we have a modal or something, right? We have a little box in modal, and the modal said, oh, for reasons, make all grids have an alignment of left or top. Yeah, make all grids have an alignment of top. That means any grid that renders in that modal will automatically absorb that property. So that's what this context system is. We're just hooking into that and plucking out the properties by doing this, right? But we're just enhancing it in a little way by using this context system. So I have to, previously we used it from WPG2 context. I don't know if we're still doing that. Let me just double check. Apologies if this is a little long-winded to kind of explain these things. If you're watching this after the fact, please feel free to skip ahead or like watch at 2x speed or whatever the case may be. And if you already know this stuff, but I feel like it's helpful to kind of give context into this because it's quite complex in a way, but complexity is needed to support the features that we want for the system. So what am I doing? Oh yeah, I'm checking the font size picker. Just double check to see where that's coming from. Right, it's still coming from WPG2 context. Cool. That's fine. Why is this mad? Is it mad because I didn't npm install or something? External dependencies comment. Oh, right. So there's like a ESLint thing that thing should be, that dependencies need to have a prefix of like external links or something like that, external dependency or whatever. For my VS Code, I have auto format. So if I were to save, I think this will fix it. If not, I'll just do this. It's fine. So, oh yeah. Within the G2 components directory, we're not using WordPress elements, which is, WordPress element is basically the abstraction on top of React. We're using React directly, so we have to make a tiny adjustment here to do this. WordPress element, use memo. Great. Oh, this one needs to be another thing. Here, WordPress dependencies. And this one is, what is it? Internal dependency. All right, cool. Cool, so we need another file, grid.utils. So if I were to go back to here, we have grid.utils. This utils file is just basically a generic kind of catch-all utilities drawer, put everything in there kind of file that's used in this particular component. In this case, it contains some constants that can handle some remapping of certain alignment names. That's all this does. Cool. So now we're able to use grid.utils. Sorry, grid-utils. That's happy. Why is this not happy? Oh, it needs a space. All right, that's happy now. Okay, so when you're copying and pasting files from G2, you may notice this very intimidating looking JS doc thing. What this does is that this is it does some TypeScript stuff so that if you were to use this component, it knows how to kind of hint at the properties of a component a little bit better. Okay. So if you're like me and your TypeScript skills are weak, like mine are, this is like, I can't even with this. I'm sorry, Sarah. Sarah's the one that's written a lot of this. She's done an amazing job at typing stuff within the G2 components repo. I do my best at making modifications wherever I can. I'm sure I screwed it up somewhere. But if you're like me and you don't really understand TypeScript stuff, just copy and paste this in there. It should be fine in theory. We'll probably catch it during the PR review to like make some adjustments. I'll do my best. I'm sure other folks like Sarah and John Searle can help provide some more kind of expertise in that area. But anywho, that's what that stuff is, if you see it. I wish I had a better answer, but I don't. Okay. So just going down this thing, it's just complaining because we need to add spaces, so that's what I'll do. So you may see, in this case, you may see some things like this. Use responsive value, which comes from the style system. I'm not going to dive too deep into some of these properties here, like use responsive value. Effectively, within some of the systems, like the context system or the style system, the style system especially, we've created a lot of hooks or mix-ins and whatever to make the styling experience or the process of writing styling code more consistent across all the various components. In this case, this taps into the responsive system within the style system to grab the appropriate value. I know that doesn't mean anything when I say that, but that's effectively what that is. I won't go too deep into that because that's not the main concern of this particular stream. But just know that there are a lot of things that have been created and provided within the style system that a lot of the G2 components use to do things, from creating inline CSS stuff, class consolidation, responsive values, not breakpoints, reduce motion handling, a bunch of other things. All those are provided in the style package. You know what? I'm just going to do some like format document thing. Right, so that just makes this not mad at me anymore. Okay, why is this mad? Classes are already defined in the upper scope. Is it? Oh, it doesn't like that I'm doing this. That's fine. Just rename this to something else. I'll just rename this to, I don't know. Sure, doesn't really matter. Cool. So this is the first little interesting thing that you may see within the G2 components stuff. This CSS function. So what you can do with the CSS function, you can use it if you're familiar with things like emotion or styled components or one of those libraries. The CSS function allows you to effectively write inline styles, but it's done in a way that the style system understands. So what this actually gives us in return is a class name. So this actually gives us something like this, some garbled hashed class name. But the compiler has compiled this into an actual style rule somewhere. So when this component renders on the screen, it'll inject it, and that's how the class will render. Sync it up with this kind of hashed class name. And you can use it either as a function like this or happy styles thing. Blue, and you would write your CSS as a string. Either one is acceptable. And I don't think it's a hard and fast rule either way. Either one's acceptable. Sometimes it's easier to do this. Sometimes it's easier to do this. In this case, because we're literally, passing these properties through that are kind of camel cased, it's just easier to do this because the style object, those keys are also camel case, so they map one to one. If we had to write it in this way, this kind of backtick string kind of thing, you basically have to break it up every single time. So you'd have to do something like align items is that, and you just repeat that. You break it for every single one to, jump between JavaScript and string and JavaScript and string. But if you do it in an inline style kind of fashion, you just pass on the properties and everything will be fine. So that's what this does. It creates a, hang on. Combined is not a good one. Custom class says, sure. I don't know. Grid classes, sure. Why is this mad at me? Expect double quotes. What? I mean, I thought I told it to format. Fine. What? What? Style lint string quotes. I think I can. There's something with my editor. When I hit save, it does double quote, and then it'll just change back to single quote. Hopefully this will be caught in the linting. This is not a big deal. I don't know. My editor, my VS Code is not too happy with Gutenberg sometimes, but this happens. Cool. So now we have our grid classes. Now we have our incoming class name. This is very important. Both of them need to resolve. And that's what this CX function does. If you've used libraries like class name, like import, say, class names from class names, this is a very, very popular one. Sometimes people might write it like this for short. Basically, this is a very intelligent little function that's able to provide class names based on certain conditions. So you can do something like is happy? If it's happy, then happy class name. Oops. Otherwise, render the sad class name. Well, that's sad, but yeah, you can do things like this. We've used it, we sprinkled it here and there within the Gutenberg components repo. But G2 Components uses this a lot, and the reason is because we need to resolve class names and other properties, specifically class names in particular. Because if you were to use a grid component or any other component from the G2 Components repo, you give your own custom class name, for example, happy, and that should work. Like happy should be passed through ultimately to the thing that renders. Super happy, whatever it is you want. It's just like a regular div or anything else. And that's what this does. We ensure that your class name is passed through correctly while applying our own. And there is a difference between this CX and if you were to use, say, class names. The difference is this CX actually comes from the compiler, the style compiler. It recognizes all the random, the randomly generated hashed class names like this may give, right? So it's able to pay attention and understand things like this, and it orders it in a way that ensures that stuff works correctly. Because CSS is a cascading effect, it'll apply styles based on certain order that you have the class names or the styles or whatever. It's able to recognize and synchronize that correctly. However, if you were to say do this, sure, the class names will ultimately, be rendered through as a string as you normally would, but the order may be incorrect, which may result in styles that are broken. So it's important to use the CX from the styles, WP styles, when we're consolidation stuff. Cool. And this is memoized, just a slight performance thing, paying attention to all these properties. Most likely this will only fire once unless you're doing some strange thing where you're constantly adjusting the grid value. But yeah, this is just a performance thing just because this CSS property, although it's very, very fast, right? It's still work that the JavaScript engine needs to do. So you'll see use memo and various other kind of memoization techniques sprinkled throughout the G2 Components library. It's just there for performance reasons. So that's why that's there. Cool. So when all is said and done, right, in this particular use grid brains hook thing, we've plucked out the properties. We've done some fancy things with hooks. We've created a unique class name that taps into the style system. We've done the class name pass through. And we have created a brand new series of props that our component can understand and render. And this is a very simple one. All this does is that it just makes a class name. And everything else is passed through, which is fine. This is a very, very simple one. There are more complex ones, but this one's a very simple one. Cool. So now, where are we at? We are here. in our main component. Use grid coming from, this is adjusted now, use hyphen grid. That's happy. This is not happy. Let me just see where we've stuck that. Okay, so now it's in a different directory. Utils, create component. I think. Oh, there we go. It's doing that thing where we need that. All right, cool. So let's take a look at this really, really quickly. It doesn't do too much. Okay, ignore the very scary looking type JS doc stuff here. I can't even. Bless you, Sarah, for being able to write this and understand this. I can't even, though. So what this does effectively is it's just a convenient little wrapper that binds our hook, our brain, with a view component. And view is, it's like I mentioned earlier on the stream, it's a very, very smart div provided by the component system. So we bind the brains, we bind the view together, and we register it with a specific name. In this case, grid. We're creating a grid component with our brains, and we're telling the view, hey, just render as a div. And it all comes together into this grid component, because we don't really need to do anything else, right? If we were to kind of write this from scratch, let's just pretend, you basically just do this. Enhanced props, I guess. And it's like use context system. We're going to give it props, and we're going to tell it a grid, and then we're going to do this. If we were to write this manually without this kind of hook, this is basically what we do. It does some other things, like it kind of handles memoization kind of stuff for us. But I mean, you can take a look at the code. It doesn't do too much. Oh yeah, it also registers a namespace, and lastly, it connects it to our context system. So it does a little bit more, right? So, oh yeah. I guess you would do something like this. Const export const grid equals context system, I think. What's this? Context connect. Right, so we're connecting that with that. Right, so if you were to write this manually without this, it'd basically be this. We're creating a component, hooking it up to the context system, doing some prop remapping, rendering into the view, and lastly, we're going to export the component, while connecting it into the context system. This is connecting it to the context system. This is grabbing things from the context system. We're going to use things from the context system, and we're going to connect it to the context system. So if we're able to use the create component thing, and that can happen. If it's a little bit more complex, though, so in the case of, say, font size picker. Nope. Here, right? We'll have to do it a little bit manually. So here you can see we're using the brains, we're using the hook, grabbing things that we need, right? Maybe some change handlers, some size values or whatever, passing it into little subcomponents or little views, right? We're creating this font size control component. And finally, we're going to export this guy while wrapping it with this context connect higher order component, connecting it to the context system. This is it. This is that process done kind of manually, because we need to, pluck things out and kind of reassemble things before we ship it out. This one is very, very simple, straightforward, where it's like, okay, we don't need to do much. We have the brains, we have the view. We're just gonna, create this component. We're just gonna ship it out. It's fine. It's very straightforward. So that's what that is. I'm just gonna check the export of this thing. Export default. Right, so that's the same. So inside here, we're going to export default as grid. So that is fine now. This one is sad. Why is it sad? It's sad because of single quotes thing. I think we can ignore that for now. The other thing that you may see when you G2 components into here is you may see this giant example thing. So within the G2 components repo, we do have this automated website doc builder thing. So if I were to jump to say g2components.com, this lovely marketing landing page thing, very nice looking. Basically, I just basically copied Apple because they do some cool things. But this is effectively what this is. All this stuff combined with TypeScript thingies, it just generates this little example here. The doc site generator is able to understand this stuff and is able to output this stuff. That's all it is. It doesn't necessarily apply into the Gutenberg repo anymore because there's no like doc site generator or anything like that. It's still helpful as inline docs because I think if you hover your mouse over this thing, you're able to see how it's being used. Except I might have to change this guy. So let me just check the font size picker, how that's done. Oh, that's been removed and oh, we just never wrote docs for that. Okay. So we'll have to make some adjustments here. And how is that done? If I were to jump to this main export file, just going to do, oh, this is gigantic. Grid. Here, alphabetical. Experimental grid. Oh my god, I can't. There's too many things going on. Experimental grid. Okay, so it's exporting experimental grid from there. So if I were to jump into here, so I'll need to do something like this. Import experimental grid as grid from WordPress components. Right, because we've added this to WordPress components, it needs some new kind of inline docs like that. So we can see. This is slightly confusing. So this actually, this CSS property and all this stuff, it comes from the style system. I'm just gonna remove that for now. Lorem ipsum text, just need some lorem ipsum. I'll just write this word 1, 2, 3. It's a little easier. Oh, I need some other things inside of here as well. This is the tricky thing. Text is not. This is it's a bummer. Have I exported view? Have we exported view? I don't think so. So we got to export this guy. Okay, I got to make slight adjustments here. Let's see. Export. We got to export default as view. We got to export. Okay, this is not related. I'll do this in a kind of refactor after the stream because I don't want to take too much time away from what I'm doing here. So again, I'll also adjust this, but the main thing is make sure the docs kind of makes, the JS doc kind of makes sense in relation to the component so that people can basically copy and paste this code and it should work. Right now it doesn't because we have some missing exports, this view thing, which is the thing I kind of got hung up on. Anywho, so we have our component, we have our utils, we have our brains, we have our use little hook, we have our exports is all bound together. We have our global export of the component in our main index file, this gigantic list of everything. And now we just need to add our test and our stories. Let me just see how tests are done. It's in an index file, and then you just add things. Okay, fine. We don't need that. Testing library. we already used that, so this should be, we'll check. Yeah, that's fine. View from dot 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 view, no longer the case. I think it's that. Okay. So these are just very simple snapshot tests that are coming from the G2 Components repo. Feel free to refactor these to something better. The reason why a lot of the tests within the G2 Components repo are snapshot tests because I needed something. I needed some sort of tests. And snapshot tests are literally better than nothing. So we have that. But ultimately, unit tests and more thorough kind of integration-ish kind of tests, they're better than snapshot tests. But yeah, they are better than nothing, and it's a good starting point. So now that we have our tests in here, let's try running it. So if I were to, in the Gutenberg repo, if I were to npm run, oh, sorry, I need to probably do an npm install to start. And just a heads up, if for some reason this video or the stream cuts out, it's because my computer's crashed. It has been crashing almost daily. Now, I don't really know why. Typically, npm installing with VS Code or something open may cause that. We'll see. I think it should be fine, but who knows? Who knows? Great, it didn't break. I think that's a command. I may be wrong. All right, I'm just going to run the unit test suite. I'm going to press P to pause it. I think that's what P stands for. And I want to just run it against grid. Right here. It should pass. Oh, it fails for reasons. Why is it failing? Render isn't working. Huh. What? But it's used in other places and it's fine. What? Yeah, it's right there. Okay, if this doesn't work, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I'll probably have to debug this after the fact. Whatever it is you're seeing, I mean, you may as well, I don't know. But in theory, if we were to copy and paste the test into here, it should be fine. If not, you may have to do some debugging, which I guess I'll have to do. And the other thing we got to do is just copy and paste the stories, which doesn't do too much, I don't think, for the grid component. Stories, we're just going to make an index.js and paste it in here. We will need / view. Oh, I think I know the issue. There. Actually, I want it. Yeah, I'm just going to keep that. I think this fixes the problem. Okay, there, yeah. There was an import problem. Crisis avoided. There was an import problem. We just made that adjustment. From there. This should be fine. Why is it mad? View's already been declared. Oh, I see. That's why. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. 1, 2, 3, 2, 3. Don't need that anymore. Cool. So basically just copy and pasting the stories, making sure the imports are correct, removing any references to React, and making sure the title is correct as well. What component / thing. All right, component / grid. Okay. So now what you can do, this should pass. I didn't break anything. what I can do now is I can fire up Storybook. So we can actually see the component that we're migrating over. Together, we've copied and pasted all the main code. We've done our rename, re-exports, and all that stuff. Walk through how all the various systems, why they need to exist. Boo-boos along the way, like messing up the exports, not getting Jester run properly. It's all part of the process. I'm sure you're gonna run into this as well. If not, then you did a fantastic job. I ran into a lot of problems, but okay. Storybook is building, and again, if this cuts short, it's because my computer is crashed. And let me just double check the fans. Oh yeah, the fans. So, yeah, it's so. I have 2 power supplies plugged into my computer. I don't know if that makes a difference, but I have 2 of them. 2 USB-C things plugged into my MacBook Pro. And because of the load that is under right now, that is doing Node things, VS Code things, and also live streaming on Twitch, it can't charge. The battery is slowly being drained as it's my power trying to do all this. Man, Storybook takes a long time. Cool. Did complain though. What was it complaining about? Experimental grid was not found. Oh yeah, that's okay. So if I were to check out the grid component, we should be able to see 1, 2, 3. Cool. Cool. So the grid is working. If I were to inspect element on this thing, cool. You can see that we have our grid component, right? You can see that it has all the custom class names being generated, like that, the hash class names and whatever. So one interesting with grid is you can customize a column based on the viewport size, and you can do it with an array. And what this basically maps to is this is mobile, this is tablet, and this is desktop. So in mobile, we'll have 2 columns. On tablet, we're going to preserve that. We'll continue having 2 columns. And on desktop, we'll have 4 columns. So that's what that is. So we can see we have, let's see, 4 columns, 2 columns or something. Oh, sorry, 1 column. It's not preserved. All right. If I add 4, there we go. 4, 2, and I'll just make this 1 so we can see it a little easier. So we have 1 column, right? 1, 2, 4. Cool. So that taps into the responsive system of the grid of the style system, which knows how to handle all that. Bringing this back full circle, that's what this is. This responsive value thing. It does some media query things, and it does some style thingies, whatever, and it's able to provide the class names with an appropriate value for it to render the styles based on the current viewport size, allowing you to be able to write viewport values like this, responsive kind of breakpoint values like this very, very easily. That's all thanks to the style system. So now we have that. We're able to do a grid of 1, 2, and 4 very, very easily. And the grid seems to be working in the context of Storybook. The only things I need to fix are how the things are being exported. So I'll do that now. Storybook is working. Jest is working. Everything here seems to be fine. The only thing I need to do is copy over the README file. We'll need to make some adjustments in the README file. Okay. I gotta get rid of this meta information. You may see some of this going on. This is again, stuff automatically generated from the build system of the G2 components repo. We'll just get rid of that because it's not relevant. We'll have to adjust some things here. Experiment grid as grid. One view, 2, 3. Come on. Just this as well. Experimental view as view. I'll need to adjust that export thing to make sure that works. Make sure it's JSX and not JSX live. Live is the little thing within the doc generator. A live kind of code editor thing for the doc site. Not relevant in the context of WordPress components. We can probably leave all these props alone. That's fine. Get rid of this auto-generated text. Get rid of the C also, which is a link to other components. Again, for the G2 components website, not relevant here. So we have a very simple kind of README file with a little demo, some props. The downside, though, just giving you a heads up, is that within the G2 components are actually all automatically based on however it is a component's typed. Here, we'll have to update these manually. And that's currently how it works within this particular project. In the future, we do something in regards to tooling and scripting where we don't have to manually do things here. It'll just understand the properties based on either JS docs or TypeScript or whatever the case may be, and automatically update and inject these values so that we don't have to do it. But for now, we'll have to manually do it, and we're just copying and pasting the docs into here. Cool. So I think that is everything. The main export file, the main component, the utilities, the README file, the brains, that is the use component hook, the tests, the stories, and our brand new, we have our component, it's migrated correctly. The test pass, it looks fine in Storybook, it works as expected. And if you need to double check, feel free to check the story here against the one that is from the G2 components repo. The latest stuff should be found at g2-components.xyz, which is a weird domain. What are those called? TLDs or something? It's a weird .com thing. But you know what? XYZ costs $2 a year, and that's why I got it. So you can check it against here. If I were to check the grid component here, it should more or less work the same. The story does look a little bit different because the grid component in the G2 context uses placeholder, which is another component. But yeah, the whole grid thing should work very, very similarly. And you can just double check it. Cool. And the last thing we have to do is to make sure the exports work as intended. So I need to do something like this. Export grid as experimental grid. I also need to do that for view as experimental view from here. Alrighty. So is Storybook happy now? Like, are we grid gap only works at blah blah blah? Oh, that is not related. Does not support iron grid. Okay, so these I'm just checking the logs to see what it's complaining. It's currently complaining about things that are not related to the changes we made. I don't think. Truncate as experimental truncate. Yeah. Yeah. So in the G2 components repo, In addition to exporting the main component, we also export the component hooks. So for example, use grid, we would also export use grid, use truncate, all those guys. But I think for now, in WordPress components, we'll keep that limited. We'll only export the components that folks will need to build things, not necessarily the low level bits that help construct everything else. So in the context of grid, yes, although grid does export export everything as grid, in our main publicly exposed exporter, we'll limit it to just grid. This is this is important just because for other components such as text is a really good one. Other components will need to use those hooks, right? So you can imagine, you have larger components being built with like smaller bits. So let's say, for example, we have some sort of label component, right? Label maybe uses, say, text underneath the hood, and text maybe uses view, or text is fine. And then, the children will render inside of here. So instead of consuming text directly, what we can do is in the label, like in this use label brains area, it can actually do this. We'll just use the brains of text because we don't actually need the view rendering part. We just need the brains part. We'll just use the business logic key kind of stuff inside of text. That is the component hook. We'll add that to our use label component hook. That way, when we render in the presentation thing of our label, we don't need this text component anymore. We have the functionality of it. We can just adjust how the thing is being rendered. This is better for performance. Hey, that's okay. I definitely will be uploading this to YouTube. Little all over the place, I must say. I guess I'll try my best to add those timestamp things that I started seeing on YouTube. Hopefully that'll make it better. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in though. What was I saying? Oh yeah. If we were to compose component hooks together like this, way more performant. And if you were to check this is a big thing during one of the G2 component refactor phases. If we were to check out the component tree of G2 components, it's very, very, very minimal compared to components that you may see from other libraries. And I'm not calling anybody out. Just want to give, this is the reality of it. You can see. So if I were to check out, say, a button, buttons are great components to check things out on. Let's see. Because they're so complex. I love buttons and I hate buttons in a way. And when I say hate, I mean it's like a love-hate kind of. I mean it in a kind of enduring way. Buttons, I love them because they're so everywhere. I know that doesn't make sense, but they're used everywhere. They're very, very important, and they're so complex because they can render in so many different variations. You can put icons in front of them. You can render by icons only. You can make them round, big, small, whatever. So they have a lot of things that they need to handle and consolidate. So, anywho, if I were to take a look at a Material UI button, if I were to take a look at the component tree of it, right now they're kind of rendered anonymously, but for this single button, for each of these buttons, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 8 layers of stuff that's going on. I'm gonna exclude this memo thing because it doesn't actually do anything. But there's 8 layers of components that are happening, either context consumers or whatever that's composed to create the button. Let me just check out the G2 button. It would be embarrassing if this one was very, very deep, but we'll see. I don't think it would be, but we'll see. Again, gonna ignore the memo part. We have 1, 2, 3, basically 4 and views. Yeah, it's a little bit, again, buttons are very, very complex. It's not as deep as the other one. And the reason for that is a lot of this is we're only using the hook part of various components to kind of build things together. We're not actually using the component to construct this stuff. In the earlier phases of G2, that's kind of how we did it before this hook thing. So if you were to take especially Flex, if you were to take a look at any component back in the day, there are just so many layers, right? Because it's just component after component using each other. And then, a simple button could have like 20 layers, which you may see if you were to take a look at certain component libraries. But using this hook method, this use grid thing here, you were able to kind of bypass that. We were able to eliminate the need for that kind of layering, and it's just much more performant. And if you're not familiar with this is basically the React development tools that you can download as an extension for Chrome. I don't know about other browsers. For Chrome, they have this available as an extension. It's great for any kind of React development, especially if you're doing component work and you need to check like render nesting and performance stuff. They have a profiler in here as well, which is really cool. Feel free to poke around at that. Very, very helpful. Timestamps are nice. Cool. I'll be sure to try my best to do that. It'll probably be all over the place, but we'll see. So all of that has been refactored. Jumping back to this integration thing, all the files have been moved here. Test pass, stories pass, they work. Exports are done correctly. All that I think is to create a pull request. So what I'm going to do, okay. So I do my get kind of process using the command line tool. This may not be your process. You may use the application or GUI or something. Use whatever works. This just happens to be my flow. And I want to talk about this part. In case you don't know what this is, I'm not a Git master by any chance, by any means. I just learned along the way and just use it as I use it. So this thing is if you do git add everything, but you do hyphen P stands for, but you're able to kind of see these things presented in little chunks, which you're able to say like yes, no, skip, or whatever the case may be. So in this chunk, this looks correct to me. Yes, commit that. These look correct to me. Yes, commit that. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for brand new files. It only works for changes, but I mean, it's good enough for me. And it's basically all of grid. Okay, just as a double check, I'm just going to run the test unit test thing. All right. In the meantime, I'm going to close VS Code in case it crashes. I'm also going to close all my tabs in case my computer crashes. Oh my goodness, I can't click on anything right now. This is a very boring thing. I'm literally just watching this number down here to make sure everything's fine. Nothing else is really happening. Just double checking. Oh yeah, my computer's still very angry. Earlier we ran the test to make sure the grid component was fine, which is good. This one I'm just making sure everything is fine. So where this is helpful is like making sure your imports and your exports are done correctly. Because if they're not, then things WordPress component, and these tests are useful for catching that. Cool. This is likely caused by tests leaking due to improper teardown, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know what that means, but everything seems to be fine. Alrighty. Pre-commit hooks doing their thing. Okay. So I'm going to cancel out of this for a second. I suspect, yeah, so brand new README file was added. And I think what happens is Gutenberg adds it to this doc manifest thing. So during the pre-commit phase. So I guess we'll just add that. Commit again. Cool. So I'm just going to say add grid component for a new component system. And I'll be sure to add a lot more description text in the PR that I'm going to make. So now I'm just going to push this up. Push U origin add component. So if you're not a core contributor, you probably have to push this up to your own fork of Gutenberg. And then from there, you can create a pull request into Gutenberg. But I'm able to push it here into the Gutenberg repo. Thankfully, I'm able to do that because that makes it slightly easier. And I can create a pull request here. And this is where I would fill out everything, be good, and take, have some GIFs or some screenshots to kind of describe it. Link back to the issue and start the review process. So if you're attempting to do this, if you're going to help with this G2 components migration thing into Gutenberg, first off, thank you so much. That'll be very, very helpful. That'll help folks like myself and Sarah a lot. But if you are going to do this for reviewers, feel free to add either myself, my GitHub handle is itsjohnq. Oh, I guess I can't do that because I'm me, or Sarah. And we'll probably be the best people to review this for you, just because we've worked on it in depth in the other repo. We'll know what to kind of look for. For myself, if you're doing TypeScript things, I probably won't help you too much there because I can't. I'm a noob. I'm basically a TypeScript noob. So hopefully Sarah and maybe some other folks can help you there. So yeah, that is it. This is a very long video. I apologize. But I wanted to talk about all the various parts and give context as to why and all that stuff in terms of constructing in terms of how the components are built the way they are within the G2 repo. The differences between the G2 repo and Gutenberg in terms of naming conventions, where to put things, and so on. Things to consider when exporting. Yeah, and little things in between. So hopefully this was helpful. Thank you, Spin Girl, for hopping on this live stream. You're very, very kind. And I'll be sure to upload this to YouTube so other folks can check this out later on. I'll try my best to add timestamps. And hopefully this was helpful. You've been wonderful. I'm Q, and I will take off and hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Catch you later. Stay safe. Bye. Cool. Bye, Spin. Catch you later.